So good day, everyone. I am Kenneth and I am with Noriel. Today we'll be reporting the 17th reading, which is the climate change. So this reading is the chapter 9 on the book Practical Ethics of Peter Singer. Now, before we proceed, we want to ask you, how do you feel seeing these photos? A polar bear with her two cubs on a melting ice and the recent happening of NASA scientists getting arrested at the time or at a climate change protest. So these are just some of the evidences of how the issue in climate change and in global warming has been affecting the lives not just of the human race but also the other living organisms in our planet. So what are the relevance of these images? According to Peter Singer, the polar bear perched on a melting chunk of ice has become an icon of the campaign against global warming, making the point that it is not only humans who will suffer from climate change, but also millions of animals will die in droughts and floods. Some will be able to move as their environments change, but for others, there will be nowhere to go. Global warming will cause extinctions on a vast scale. Now let us define what climate change means. According to the United Nations, climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. These shifts may be natural, but since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, which produces heat-trapping gases. Singer's argument in this chapter started in presenting data from valid sources such as World Health Organization. So he mentioned that the warming of the planet caused an additional 140,000 deaths in 2004, as compared with the number of deaths there would have been had average global temperatures remained as they were during the period of 1961 to 1990. So these deaths are mainly due to climate-sensitive diseases such as malaria, dengue, and diarrhea, which are common when there is a lack of safe water, and also malnutrition resulting from crops that fail because of high temperatures or low rainfall. So in comparison, the World Health Organization's report in 2021 says that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. So from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress, similar to what we have mentioned before. Moreover, areas with weak health infrastructure, mostly in developing countries, will be the least able to cope without assistance to prepare and respond. Singer also mentioned that changes are already apparent in the densely settled delta regions in Egypt, Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam, which are all at risk from rising sea levels. The Sunderban Islands also, which are home to 4 million Fijians, has two islands that already vanished. So hundreds of families also had to move to camps for displaced people. Some small Pacific nations like the Maldives, Kiribati, and Tuvalu are in similar danger. Within a few decades, according to Singer, these nations may be submerged beneath the ocean. So by 2080, Singer noted that United Nations report a 2.0 degrees Celsius to 2.4 degrees Celsius temperature rise would affect 1.2 billion people due to scarcity in water resources and would expose additional 16 million people to coastal flooding, while temperature rising to over 3.3 degrees Celsius would affect 3.5 billion due to scarcity in water resources and would expose additional 29 million people to coastal flooding. So this led to Peter Singer's argument that even if we were to take his argument in the previous chapter that was reported by Mikhail and Justin last 2 weeks, the facts of climate change would demonstrate clearly that we are harming hundreds of millions of humans. We're deviating from this view that the only obligation we have to strangers is to avoid harming them. So Peter Singer mentioned John Locke. So he's a philosopher and a physicist, also known as the father of liberalism, as he proposed the idea on property that we can take what we want and still live. So let's take, for example, the community in Barangay Lacandula. So every resident puts their waste down a giant drain, and no one knows what happens to the waste after it goes down the drain. But Because it disappears and doesn't seem to bother anyone, no one worries about it. No matter how much people from Barangay Lacandula pour down the drain, others can do the same for as long as anyone can remember. The capacity of the drain to dispose of our waste has seemed limitless. Hence, they believe that they can take what they want and still live. However, when the time comes that they became aware that the drain is not limitless but still continue throwing their waste down the drain, that's the time when they are no longer living enough and as good for others, and hence the right to unchecked waste disposal becomes questionable. And the evidence shows that we are already using resources beyond its capacity. So for reference, 1 ppm or 1 parts per million is equal to 0.0001% of gas. So before the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere amounted to only 270 ppm. Then humans began to burn coal in large quantities and later oil and gas. So in 2010, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached 390 ppm. So this is a higher level than at any time in recorded history. And it is still increasing at 2 ppm each year. So on 2008, most scientists agreed on 450 ppm as the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that should not be exceeded if we are to prevent a greater increase than 2 degrees Celsius. So on current trends, UN reported that we will reach 450 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 2040, so 18 years from now. So currently, our planet has 415 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as of 2021 report of World Health Organization and UN. So some of the visible examples is the Arctic Ocean, which is now ice-free in summer. According to experts, this is a symptom of global warming caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Another example is the permafrost in Siberia that are already thawing. So this permafrost prevents methane from being released from underneath the earth to the atmosphere. But since they are melting, the methanes are being released, which contributes to further warming of the planet. So it boils down to the problem that already exists roots to another problem. So these are clear manifestations that we are no longer living enough and as good. So Peter Slinger mentioned that according to James Hansen, a scientist from the US National Aeronautics and Space Administration or NASA, if we wish to preserve a planet similar to that on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, we need to reduce carbon dioxide at most 350 ppm, very far from the current ppm in our atmosphere, which is 415. Now it raises the question, how can we decide who should cut back the most? So dito, Peter Singer mentioned Robert Nozick and his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So philosopher Robert Nozick made a useful distinction between historical principles and time-slice principles. An historical principle is one that says, to understand whether a given distribution of goods is just or unjust, we must ask how the distribution came about, and we must know its history. In contrast, a time-slice principle just looks at the existing distribution at this moment of time and asks on the basis if it is just. So, an historical principle, it is often applied in the case of pollution, which is you broke it, you fix it, also known as the polluter pays. So if we apply this principle to climate change, then it would assign responsibility for fixing the problem to each country in proportion to the amount that the country has contributed to causing the problem. So historical emissions of carbon dioxide are relevant because, according to Peter Singer, most of the carbon dioxide emitted a century ago is still in the atmosphere today. So this is a report of Brazilian government during the discussion at the UN or the United Nations Conference on climate change in 1997. So looking at the table, the US is responsible for 20% of the temperature rise, European nations and Brazilians, Latin America for 14%, all of East Asia, including China, with only 10%, and all of South Asia, including India, with only 7%. So on the you broke it, you fix it view, therefore, it is the United States and the long industrialized European nations, Latin America, that ought to bear the largest share of the burden of solving the problem. So the China offered support or backed this report, but also pointed out that contributions should be considered on a per capita basis. So they 5 Chinese Americans and academic policy-oriented thinkers made a report called Carbon Equity in 2009 conference on climate change in Copenhagen. So they argue that the fact that China has a much larger population than the US has to be taken into account in apportioning responsibility for the greenhouse problem. So the assumption here is that each person is entitled to an equal share of the atmosphere. And we should be looking at the extent to which people in some nations have, in past centuries, used more than their share. So the report calculates that over the period from 1850 to 2004, the average American has been responsible for putting 21 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere compared to Chinese, and 53 times as much as the average Indian. On average, on the average, Britons and Canadians are responsible for 16 times as much carbon being released in the atmosphere compared to Chinese, and 40 times as much as Indian. So the principle of historical responsibility thus indicates that almost all of the sacrifices required to stop global warming should be made by the older industrialized nations. So it's true that the industrialized revolution or industrial revolution made possible the development of science and technology, and it's truly that it has been benefiting up until now billions of people all over the world. But another argument presented by Peter Singer is that the objection holding the industrialized nations responsible for all their emissions since the Industrial Revolution is that for most of this period, they did not know that these emissions would be harmful. So according to Peter Singer, human-induced global warming was not seriously studied until the 1970s. However, climate change only became an issue of international concern in the 1980s. At US congressional hearings in 1987, James Hansen warned of the dangers of global warming. So this was at the time the hottest year on record. But now, it does even one of the top 10 hottest years as of 2022. So at the 2009 United Nations Summit meeting on climate change, President Paul Kagame, he's the president of Rwanda, pointed out that climate change will probably have a more severe impact on Africa than on any other part of the world. And yet, Africa has fewer resources to draw on to meet this challenge. So President Kagame went on to point out that climate change is only very marginally, if at all, a problem of Africa's making. Nevertheless, he offered to forget about the responsibility of the industrialized nations for causing the problem, because for him, all of us humans, are all facing a struggle for survival. So he said that he did not want a new round of blame game, which would not only be in poor taste, but also counterproductive. So this refers to the time slice principles, or principles which takes no account of the past and gives everyone an equal share of the atmosphere from now on. So what would equal shares mean in practice? So suppose that we aim to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at a level that will prevent us exceeding 450 ppm carbon dioxide. So this principle proposes that instead of looking at the history of among which countries has the highest carbon emission, we must instead allow these industrialized nations to continue their production. However, trading their use of carbon per capita by paying countries producing lower carbon, such as Africa and Sri Lanka. So through carbon trading scheme, they say that it will solve poverty as well as solve the issue in climate change. However, many criticize that this is an unrealistic idea because it is not possible for industrialized nations like Germany and the United States to meet such dramatic reductions in the short term, or at least not without devastating economic consequences that would be likely lead to a change of government and a reversal of the policy, whether the emissions of each nation could be properly checked against the nation's quota, and what would happen if it were not. So according to the critics, without a reliable means of verifying cuts or verifying emission cuts, nothing will be achieved. Also, they say that payments from rich nations to poor nations will only reduce poverty if the government if the government to which use this money to which they are paid use for what purpose they are paid for. So Hansen points out that such schemes have a perverse effect on altruistic action. So that's why many criticize that this principle will not break. So to discuss further about climate change, here's Noriel. So Noriel, please take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Kenneth. Now, one of the other solutions that was proposed to the different nations of the world is the principle of luxury and subsistence emissions. No? So first off, what are luxury emissions? Luxury emissions are greenhouse gases that are emitted to satisfy people's luxury, like recreational driving or excessive use of electricity, or simply put, anything for people's happiness. No? Subsistence emissions, rather, are greenhouse gases that are emitted to support the existence of people, like agriculture or development of land and similar activities. No? These terms are key to favor countries who are affected by climate change and are economically worse off than others, and to promote sustainable development to regulate greenhouse emissions. Now, next slide, please. Now, the problem with luxury and subsistence emissions is that the sustainability of development itself also contributes to climate change, and that countries who contribute the most greenhouse gases can't and actually won't regulate their citizens' greenhouse emissions due to some reasons. One of those reasons is that if they do regulate their country's greenhouse gas emissions, it would become a hit, or it would become a very big economic problem for them, or it would hinder their economical prosperity. So it is lastly, it is also hard to appropriately distinguish how much a country should contribute in lessening greenhouse gas emissions, as luxury and luxury and subsistence emissions cohabitate in the form that they're all greenhouse gases. So it's hard to differentiate the two once they're already up in the atmosphere. So, for example, we have China, whereas a large amount of the nation's greenhouse emissions comes both from luxury emissions from the cities and subsistence emissions from the countryside. The problem there is that there are less Chinese are actually contributing to luxury emissions, and a greater number contributes to subsistence emissions, and that it gets even harder to solve once other countries are involved. So the problem of population still is one of the biggest problems when it comes to solving climate change. So next slide, please. So now, since the governments won't and actually can't regulate their greenhouse emissions, back in 2007, the then president of Uganda told North America and Europe that they're causing aggression to Africa by causing global warming. Now, aggression was keyed as a more heavier term, but is it really a form of aggression? So the reasons why he called it aggression was because, first and foremost, the European countries and the US and Canada or North America would have more land that are more sustainable for agriculture due to the melting of the ice and increase in temperature. And overall, the increase in temperature would still be beneficial for the northern for Europe and Northern America. But this leads to the suffering of millions of lives in Africa, as global warming would then promote the spreading of tropical diseases or loss of arable lands due to the flooding or drought. And overall, it would become a strain in their economy. So it's the exact or the complete opposite of what would happen in the European nations and the Northern American nations. So he argued that this is much more destructive than that of sending troops and bombing the country itself. Now, next slide, please. Now, with such a statement, Europe and North America is actually aware of this, but as the former president of the United States, George W. Bush, said, and I quote, "We will not do anything that harms our economy because first things first are the people who live in America." Therefore, they didn't do anything at all about the Ugandan president's statement. So this also is one of the reasons why the leading governments of the world can't and won't actually do something about the climate change. It's because once they do, it would actually hinder their population's lifestyle, and it would become a bigger problem for them economic wise. And next slide, please. And so we've already tackled the effects of climate change. What are the different governments doing, and what are the probable solutions that was proposed to the different governments? No? So what should we do as individuals? No? Now, Singer wrote different perspectives on how individuals would react, or how individuals would try to save Mother Earth, or try to lessen the progression of climate change. But in conclusion, it is that in reality, as individuals, there is nothing that we can do to make a change that is actually noticeable. No? Though Peter Singer also said that what this calls for is for us to have a collective action of not just reducing our greenhouse emissions, but also encouraging others to do the same, all the while trying to have our government to actually do something and regulate carbon emissions and promote a more eco-friendly lifestyle. So what he's saying is, as individuals or as citizens of our respective countries, it is our duty to spread awareness to our peers, our fellow citizens, that climate change is actually one of the biggest problems that our world is facing right now, and that one of our duties and responsibilities is not just having a more eco-friendly lifestyle, but also urging our governments to do something to create a movement that would help save or mitigate, or at the very least prolong the life of our planet. Yeah, that is all. Thank you for listening.